Hello and welcome back to another edition of Unicorn Dispatch Live, your roughly twice a month view with your host, Bryson Bort. Yeah, I mean, it's flexible. I think we've actually had 3 in January. We're having 1 in February. Alex, we're going to be talking about the board, which means we make shit up, right? So that's what we're doing here on this episode anyway. But Unicorn Dispatch Live, you're roughly twice a month with the head unicorn, founder and CEO of SCYTHE, myself. I'm joined by a good friend, Alex Sharpe, and we are going to be talking about the board. Alex, what's up?
Well, I got to tell you, I love the calendar. We're roughly twice a month. I just think that's cool. And you know, I love the unicorn thing and unicorns twice a month. That all kind of fits, right? You know, we got the cotton candy, sprinkles, rainbows. We got all that stuff going on. I just think that's so cool. That's very, very cool.
Well, thank you very much. And we're going to be talking about the board and how to talk to the board. So talking about unicorns and rainbows, why don't we start with what mistakes in life brought you here to this point? Why are you here?
Which mistakes in life?
That's your call, right?
I like the way you phrase that. So I have often said that my career is a set of unanticipated phone calls. And that question, your question just gives another dimension to that. So a gazillion years ago in college, I was approached by NSA. I couldn't tell you that at the time. I can now. About interviewing for them. I was like, yeah, okay, sounds like fun. And I ended up taking the second lowest paid offer I received to go work for them. The actual lowest offer was from another government agency, but I thought that would be a lot of fun. And I started out on offense, doing things to other countries who didn't want done to us. And after doing that for a bit, I got pulled into the defense side, which we now call cybersecurity or information security. So that was a set of unanticipated phone calls. And then, we're all a victim of our history. I ended up going into the management consulting ranks, doing business strategy, operational improvement, merging technology, digital transformation, started a couple firms, went out on my own totally by accident, built a company, pulled it back a few years ago. And lo and behold, all the things I started doing early in my career have become popular again. InfoSec, cyber, AI, run down the list. And here I am many years later doing the same thing I started out doing early in my career. It's a hell of an arc. And yeah, series of fortunate mistakes, I guess.
Fortunate mistakes. Well, that sounds like it contradicts.
Yeah, well, it's the same, it's just kind of like, the question you asked, like, what mistakes brought you here? Well, if they brought you to a good place, how could they be mistakes, right? So the paradox is what makes it all fun, right? It's like, have you ever played golf?
I like the fact you can't get a DUI on a golf course.
That means you haven't tried hard enough. Now, so with golf, I ended up picking up golf because that's something you're supposed to do in business, and I kept getting pulled into events, and I decided that I'm going to have 2 rules on the golf course. Number 1 is I have to be good enough not to piss off the people around me, and number 2 is I have to be good enough not to piss me off. So I took lessons. And the most important thing I learned from my instructor was that golf is a game of opposites. You have to hit down for the ball to go up, right? It's the same sort of thing, like, the fortunate mistakes. They seem like it's not the right thing to do, but it works out well for you. Yeah.
So speaking of playing golf, that reminds me of the NSA. What was that like transitioning from the National Security Agency to the civilian world?
Glory and disaster.
Glory and disaster.
Absolutely glory and disaster. When I was at the agency, I loved the work I was doing. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I thought it was fascinating. I knew when I walked into the office every day, the stuff I was doing was important for our nation and our allies, and it made it felt like a privilege to be able to do that. And there's something fulfilling knowing you're dealing with stuff the average person has no concept about, right? It's just that's all glory. At the same time, the the bureaucracy and the level of management and the lack of agility was it was soul crushing, right? So you start working on the in the private sector, you bring all this knowledge, you bring all this experience with you, which is invaluable. But when you land, there's not the same sort of feeling about how you're really changing the world. And the stuff you're doing is as important as it is when you're at a high profile agency. And it's also mesmerizing about how much faster you can move without all that bureaucracy. Yeah. It it it's glory and disaster. Really is. Now you went through that. You were military and you went to the private sector. You had some sense of that.
Yeah, I got to learn it twice. So I was an Army officer, and
Right.
I did
West
a
Point grad.
West Point graduate. Yes, I got out as a captain. I got hurt during the war, and I did a stint for a few years at a global aerospace and defense manufacturer. So I worked with military and commercial aircraft was my specialty on pretty much if you've been on a plane, I was a part of building it. I don't know if that makes you feel safer or less, but true
I have a
story.
story about that. Not about you particularly, about safety on a plane. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then I did a tour in the intelligence community before I got out and started Grimm 13 years ago. Actually, almost the date. We just celebrated our 13th year anniversary last week when I went from being somebody very important in government to being nobody, starting an offensive cybersecurity consultancy by myself, sit there staring at a coffee table with a laptop going, all right, day one, all of these ideas, all this napkin math. Here's the moment of truth. Maybe I should call some people.
I get it. I get it.
You had an aircraft story?
Yeah, so my bachelor's is in hardcore engineering with concentrations in math and computer science, which makes me like the ultimate geek, or at least I was the ultimate geek. And I can tell you when I get on a plane, and I've been involved in very large scale projects. And when I get in a plane, there's a couple of things. I'm sitting on the plane and I can sit here and I could tell you the equations of how planes fly and what the mechanics are and the different forces and thrust and gravity and lift and drag. And I could tell you all this stuff and yaw and roll. And I could tell you all this stuff. But it's when the plane takes off, it's still like magic. It's still like magic because you have this big metal thing flying through the air at this incredible speed, and you're like, it's still like magic. The other part is having been involved in very large scale programs and knowing all the nuanced decisions and what goes right and what's go wrong. I'm very confident that the planes are safe, except for, there's always going to be some little glitches here and there, and unfortunately bad things happen. But knowing how the process works and the investment and the checks and balances and all the stuff that comes into play, I'm confident that everything's going to be all right. So one hand, it's magic. The other point is I'm comfortable enough from experience. I can put on my headphones and zone out for a while and be perfectly comfortable.
When I think of magic, I think of the stages of a startup. And the first stage is impossible. Somebody is actually going to pay you money for an idea. And I can remember that moment at SCYTHE. It took 4 years of R&D before we got our first paying customer as a license. Then the next one is magical. multiple customers are paying you money. Like you go from one, like that's impossible. Now you're in the magical phase. I can't believe multiple people are paying for an idea. And then once you cross the $1 million mark, now you're into just the normal business problems. And so whenever I hear magic or impossibility, I always think of those stages and how hard it is and how magical it feels as a startup to go through those stages.
All right. So I've been part of several startups. Fortunately, they've all worked out, knock on wood. Well, the ones I was a founder at have all worked out. Ones I've been part of that I wasn't a founder at. Maybe this is a rule. If you want me to help with your startup, make me a founder. Others haven't. But it truly is terrifying. If as a founder, if you knew everything you had to go through to make that company successful, you would probably never do it. You know, there's a tongue-in-cheek comment in the industry that says an entrepreneur is somebody who can jump off a cliff knowing they are going to grow wings. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Assembling the airplane on the fall down.
Yep. Building the plane in flight, right? And
that's how the whole aerospace reality came back to the metaphor. See what we did there, folks? It came all back around. You were wondering where that was all leading.
That's called an arc.
That's an arc.
We did not plan it, but I suspect we could do it again.
So you got out of the NSA, you've started a couple of companies. I think some of those companies have been very successful. Why don't you quickly share what I mean by that definition of success, which is part of what qualifies you to give such in-depth insights on how to talk to a board.
Thank you. I'll give it to you pretty quick. So I ended up running practices at Booz Allen and KPMG, great experience. And then unanticipated phone call, I got asked to become part of a startup, and we started up. I was their first CIO, first CISO, while also running a business unit. And that firm exists today. It's called the Hackett Group. It's still publicly traded. We did very, very well. We went public 20 some odd years ago. It's still around. That's great. And then I got another unanticipated phone call to go join another firm called eForce, which was subsequently taken private. Exit was also good. And, that's really the big ones. The small one was after I'd done eForce. Long story short, I ended up popping out of the industry for a while. My mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer way too young. You know the story. It's one of those stories. So I popped out of the industry, and one day I get a phone call from a senior executive I had worked with for years that was over at Time Warner. And he's like, well, come work for me. And I said, I love you, man, but no, I still doing this other stuff. And it's like, okay, 3 days a week. Said, I don't want to work for somebody else just yet. I'm not ready to go back. Fine, making independent. And I was like, okay, I'll do this for 6 weeks. 20 some odd years later, I'm still sitting here. It's the same sort of thing. So built some practices at established firms, built some startups, successful exits, IPO, did my own thing, have helped a number of companies along the way. So
let's start with the 101 stuff. What is a board? And I don't even mean that in a way that is meant to be demeaning to anyone, but I think a lot of people don't really understand what a board is, why a board exists, and what are the legal parts to making a board. Because I mean, I'll just quickly jump in there on, I've seen folks who didn't need to have a board create one because they thought they were supposed to.
Yes. All right.
What is a board?
So the formal term is board of directors. And it's actually fairly simple, and it's not totally understood. The board of directors actually represents the shareholders, people who own the company. And they basically watch over it and direct it and help guide it for the shareholders. And it's a practical reality, because if you own a piece of stock, a security, you own a piece of a company. Well, there's no way you're going to get anything done if for every decision you needed to get everybody in the room and get them to decide what to do. You'll never get everybody in the room. There's just too many of them, will take too long. So to be agile, you form these things called a board of directors, and they represent the shareholders. Now, when you're a privately held company, that's usually investors, family, friends, founders, people, again, they have the interest in the company. And they provide, there's no real pure definition of what the responsibilities of the board are. There's several different lists, but it all comes down to strategy, risk management, alignment, resources, and then monitoring and reporting. And then depending on a variety of factors, mostly if you're public or private, there's a series of obligations, which is a way of talking about laws like legislature, regulation. If you're publicly traded, you're going to have listing requirements from the different exchanges you're a part of. Depending on the sector, you're going to have different requirements. So there are many different aspects to it. So the board represents the shareholders. The exact duties depend largely on first cut, private or public, right? So are you on one of the markets? And then a lot of it depends on the sector and size and geography, because the requirements in the United States are different than the requirements in Europe, which are different than India and China. We can go right on down the list, even though there's a lot of commonality.
All right. And so let's start with common wisdom. What are some of the common mistakes that you've seen with how folks work with the board? And also answering at the same time, who are the kinds of people that should expect to work with the board? And again, I'm going to jump in with one little piece, which is particularly since we have an IT security heavy audience here, a lot of folks don't realize most CISOs don't directly report to a board.
Nope. Okay, so let's take that down from the lens from a cyber lens. Let's talk about the reporting structure first, and then we'll talk about do's and don'ts if you're ever going to be in front of a board. Most CISOs do not sit on a board. Some larger organizations, more mature organizations, absolutely. Some CIOs don't sit on boards. And actually, based on certain state laws, the CIO is not allowed to sit on the board. Kind of screws with your head now, doesn't it? So when you go back in time a little, the board is responsible for strategy, quite often measured in revenue, let's face it, right? Value creation. They're also responsible for managing risk. They're responsible for alignment, which in the fancy way of saying you got to balance your value creation and your risk mitigation without overly inhibiting innovation, right? That's a lot of what we talk about now from a technology standpoint. So how does that really work? Well, if on the average board, they typically have a risk committee. Now, financial services, remember I said there's some nuances. Financial services have to have the 3 standing committees, plus they have to have a risk committee, or it has to be a part of a standalone piece on the board. Usually the chief risk officer reports through that, and any of the risks that are coming from the CIO or the CISO tend to go through the chief risk officer. Right. So the chief risk officer is to have a direct line to the CEO, but a dotted line to the board. So the CISO and the CIO tend to get lost in that whole morass of things, and it can be rather complicated. Depending on the organization, there is no law about this. There is no law, there is no standard, there is no gun to anybody's head that really says what has to happen. But a lot of organizations, because cyber has become such a big risk, they will often have a dotted line to the risk committee, or they will have a very strong relationship to the chief risk officer, and they will often present at least the cyber side of things together. There is no cookie cutter way of handling it, at least not now. There's a cartoon I've been using since 2017 that talks about it. It's literally a board member walking over to the kids' table at like holiday dinner, inviting the CISO to come talk to them. Right. So the analogy is it's starting to become important. We're going to have, we'll take them from the kids' table to the adult table. I've been using that slide for 9 years.
So what is risk? Because business risk is a different, right? Well, that is one of the fundamental things that a board is required to report. Public companies are required to disclose the risks they've identified. Hence, you have a chief risk officer. And I'm going to throw in another curveball because there's also a discussion on the CIO and the CISO, all of that. Well, maybe not the CIO, but that might collapse into a chief risk officer. And then you have essentially somebody who's handling digital risk, somebody who's handling physical risk. Because at the end of the day, from a business perspective, we don't care what the color of risk is. Risk is risk.
Risk is risk. Now, what is risk? Now, the term has been evolving. The classic definition is managing your downside. The contemporary definition is its deviation from expected results. So we live in a world now where there's a lot of uncertainty, which is kind of ironic. So risk, the definitions of risk actually moved in that direction quite a few years ago, where they're more concerned about deviation. So from a purely financial standpoint, every publicly traded company, actually privately held company, has to make projections about different financial metrics. Most common, top line revenue, earnings per share. And whether that's measured as an EBITDA or whatever is totally different discussion. So analysts and investors would much rather you be right and consistent than not, right? So they'd rather you be consistent. So a lot of the risk definitions have moved to minimizing deviation, right? Variance. So that's the basic definition as it sits today. The traditional way of handling all this as a discipline is called enterprise risk management. And the standard framework is COSO. It was developed out of what's known as the Basel Accords. It's a very fancy name because they developed these accords in a town called Basel. So they call them the Basel Accords, right? Very fancy name. But in there, it actually categorizes risk. You'll hear terms like operational risk. The reason we talk about operational risk in our community is because technology, IT, and cyber are considered to be operational risks. So we talk about operational risk. To your point, at the end of the day, as an investor, I don't care if you missed your number. I don't necessarily care why you missed your number. I care that you missed your number. Right? Doesn't matter to me if it was a flood, it was poor management, it was a cyber attack. I want to know that so we can fix it for the future. But at the end of the day, my stock dropped because you didn't manage your risk. Yeah.
In the publicly reported companies, we've seen a shift, of course, over the years as cybersecurity has grown into becoming a risk. For many of us, I think a lot of the frustration we've had in our careers, and I always talk about this in a playoff of the Dmitry Alperovitch quote, which I think was a quote from somebody else, on there's two kinds of companies, those who've been hacked and don't know it, those who've been hacked and do know it. And mine is there's two kinds of leadership that understands security and leadership that doesn't. And the intent of that is to help practitioners understand that the priorities of leadership in a board may be different than how we understand them down at the practitioner level, where we're trying to, on a daily basis, deal with this risk. And we're the ones who get the phone call on a 3-day weekend on a Saturday to come in and handle a painful incident response because that leadership didn't properly account for the risks as we were trying to communicate them. And so one of the big shifts has been, and we can see this going back to my comment, public companies have to formally list the risks they have. And if any of you work at a public company, you can go and read the SEC filings and see how your leadership looks at risk, including how they look at cybersecurity risks.
Yes.
So interesting reading for you. Second part of that is we've seen cybersecurity grow into the top 5. And on average at public companies, it's anywhere from about number 3 to number 5 on the prioritized list of risk that the company sees. Over to you.
Actually, I think the World Economic Forum just released their global risk report, and cyber might actually be number 2 in the 2-year time frame and number 4 in the 10-year time frame. Just looking at that. So yeah, so the cyber risk is way up there. And you're right, especially publicly traded companies. The SEC finalized the cybersecurity rules, I want to say in July of 23, might have been 24, but I think it was 23. And that basically said you have to disclose material risk. Now, the concept of materiality goes back over 100 years, back to the 1930s, and that's a whole other discussion. But they have to talk about in the formal reporting. They have to talk about what is their philosophy around dealing with cyber risk. What do they think the major risks are? They have to disclose incidents. There's a lot of stuff in there that is really creating a lot of transparency around this. And you're absolutely right. One of the toughest things in our industry, and I'm going to quote Phil Venables, former CISO of Google Cloud, good guy, loved working with him. And he talks about aligning the tone at the top with the resources in the ranks. And that's exactly what we're talking about here, right? The board has one view of what's going on. The resources in the ranks, the people actually doing the work, have a different view. And when they go like this, we get into trouble. If you look at the studies, 3 primary sources of the largest vulnerabilities, this is kind of mind-numbing when you first hear it, but it makes perfect sense if you've been in the industry for a while and you think about it. It's lack of alignment between the business strategy, the security strategy and operations. Number 2 is misconfigurations, and number 3 is human error. So all those things come back to the board activities and being aligned with the resources in the ranks. It is absolutely there. We could talk about this for another hour and a half.
So a question from the audience that ties to this, right? And this gets to part of what I was talking about, which is there's this disconnect between what's happening here, that misalignment, that miscommunication, that misunderstanding, and then what's happening down at the practitioner level. And when I teach CISO workshops at IANS. Alex is also faculty at IANS. And one of the first things I point out to the CISOs is your teams don't know what you do. They don't understand what your job is. And many of you see the symptoms of this where we have the social media bickering, I don't know what you call it, where people get into debates. Should a CISO be technical? Should a CISO be this, that? I don't give a shit what a CISO's background is. I look at how effective they are at doing what they do. And one of those things is making sure their team understands what they're doing, that they're appropriate shit umbrella handling what's going up. And so the first thing I take them out on is you're not communicating to your own teams. The second, which is a common problem I see, and this is where I feel like I put my executive coaching hat on more than I put my cybersecurity hat on, is there's three directions of management. Everybody starts up by learning how to manage up because you begin your life getting a boss. You're like, all right, how do I keep my boss happy? How do I do what I'm supposed to? And then at some point, most of us grow to that first management opportunity. And now you have to learn to manage down because you now have people to manage. But as an executive, the most critical skill set is neither one of those. It's managing sideways. And when you think in your organization of how security gets informed too late, you don't feel like you're a part of the process. You don't feel like, we have this adversarial relationship. That comes down to the leadership not effectively managing sideways because that's where the leadership sets the organization up for success by getting other executives in complementary peer functions to also be a part of what you're doing. So all of that back to this question here, we have this misalignment and disconnect from the top to the bottom. And then the other part, which ties to my comment on there's two kinds of leadership, those that get security and those that don't. And when I say those that don't, it's not that they don't get security, it's to this part of the question, which is how do we get the board to understand that security is not only a compliance mandated cost center? How do you suggest broadly addressing that framing to effectively change their mental model to facilitate further meaningful counsel on the subject?
All right. It's interesting you asked this question. So I teach a couple classes for a major university, and I guest lecture quite often at different places. Just the other day, I had a student ask me, because I was talking about one of the roles of a CISO is to do myth busting. And they said, okay, what's the number one myth that has to be busted? My first thought was security does not equal compliance, right? Compliance is table stakes. So let's talk about what that means, and let's go through some examples. GDPR has some great examples on this. If anybody wants to follow up, we can have a more detailed conversation. But a number of years ago, a very large, big brand name had taken the position that this was a data protection officer, was in charge of GDPR, took the position that everybody on the cyber team needs to follow the letter of the law. The people making decisions need to be lawyers. The lawyers determine the scope, right on down the line. They got hit with an incident. And guess what the EU said? No, you're required to comply with the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Right? So there are some decisions about that. We also know a lot of incidents out there that you could follow the letter of the law in the spec, in the standard, and you are still vulnerable, and there have been hit. I can't think of a major incident that has occurred where the organization wouldn't tell you that they were compliant with a given set of standards, right? The simple facts are against that statement. I think one of the problems we run into is some organizations, different organizations have different models and different mental sets. Some are very growth oriented, some are very forward looking, others not so much. They might even be what we would call cheap. And what they're going to do is they're going to look for the absolute bare minimum way to do something. So part of your job as a cyber professional is to help educate them about all these other things that have happened, these other incidents where being compliant was not sufficient. At the end of the day, if they don't want to go there or they don't believe in it, there might not be a lot that you can do to change their mind. They might never change. They might need to suffer a significant incident. It's unfortunately a fact of life that we all have to deal with. So I wish there was a magic bullet. There isn't. There's lots of incidents to show them from a purely rational way of looking through this, that there's a lot of facts that say that is not true. But the reality is they may not be wired to accept that.
So when I tell make my joke, those that care about security and those that don't, the thing that I like to use to point that out is those that don't, it's not that they don't care about security. It's that they care about GRC primarily, because GRC is the existential foundation of business operations, right? Taking it back to just let's do risk management. What's the risk that something might happen to me by a threat? Maybe, maybe not. What's the risk that I'm going to get caught being not compliant? Pretty much 100%. So
Yeah.
from a risk management perspective, I'm going to go with the things that are 100%, and GRC is 100%. I will likely almost 100% get caught, and there will be 100% impact of some type. I can't avoid that risk. I can't mitigate it other than by being compliant. So the point that I tell this story is when I'm coaching practitioners is understand where your leadership is. It's not a question of judging where they are. It's not a question of being they're stupid or any of those things. Understanding where they are. Because if you understand where
Agreed.
they are, then you can work from that and what their priorities are to grow to where you want to get them to. And so helping them drive compliance and realizing, hey, folks, compliance is not security. Compliance is table stakes. Security is the critical thinking, the investment in critical thinking, the process, the resources that we need on top of that to dynamically mitigate the risks in cybersecurity is where we're trying to go. But if they're with compliance, start there and figure out how to baby step up there. And there's a number of ways to do it. This is where tabletop exercises can come in. This is why I think purple team exercises are very effective, because it's a transparent way to show risk. Folks in the past have used penetration test reports for a similar kind of thing. They're like, hey, let me show you that this risk is more real. I don't find that that's the gap anymore. If there was any gift of ransomware, it's the fact that your executives know what it is, right? I call it a kitchen word. Your grandmother knows what ransomware is after Colonial Pipeline.
Oh, yeah.
Now, don't ask grandma to reverse engineer or anything, or what malware is, let alone still being able to how to figure out how to turn on her phone without asking you at Thanksgiving. But the point is, they now have an understanding of the risk. You're not having to educate all of that. What you do need to do, though, is show them how that fits within the risk paradigm they understand, and what's the return on investment they're going to get from this baseline to what they need to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would tweak it a little, because you said it's all about GRC. Don't forget, cyber is a real risk. It's actually got some very unique qualities, and one of them is cyber is one of the few risks. So if you look at the ERM world, there's roughly, depending on who you listen to, there's roughly 100 risks. Some people say there's 90, some people say there's 120. Let's call it 100, just amongst friends. There's roughly 100 risks that a business needs to manage. Cyber is only one of those, but it's a very important one because it's one of the few that can cascade through all the others. It can impact all of the others. And when you look at the total cost and you compare it to what it would have taken to prevent it, there is usually a very large delta. Here's an example. Everybody knows of the 2013 incident at Target. Couple, tens of millions of credit card numbers were taken. They were compromised by getting access to credentials through the vendor that managed their heating and ventilation systems. We all know this story. What we don't talk about is that because of that incident, Target ended up in 11 years of litigation. That incident happened in 2013, but the last lawsuit wasn't filed and it wasn't settled in 2024. And they had brand damage. They had issues with credit rating. They were distracted with litigation. There's a whole pile of stuff that goes on. So, there's a lot of education here. And I absolutely agree with you that if we got any gifts from ransomware, it's about elevating this. But we also created a mindset where ransomware equals cyber. And that's one of the top 5 myths I find we need to debunk, right? Cyber is not just compliance is one, probably what I'd say is top one. Cyber is not just ransomware, is definitely in the top 3 to 5, right? It's glory and disaster. So there's a lot of pieces there.
So how do you educate your board? How do we help Like, let's say a practitioner has been asked to provide something up. Let's say a CISO is being asked to present to a board. So speaking of both of those levels, what's advice that you would give on how to present and how to educate the board?
Okay, so let's talk about the education side, and then we'll talk about the presentation side. The education side is, there are some mechanics with it. One of the things that you accurately pointed out is that it's not just managing up and managing down, it's managing across, because the CISO now has to interact with more diverse organizations than either the CISO or the CIO ever has before. Legal, compliance, privacy, right down HR, we can go right down the list, all the business units, right? We can go right down the list. And at the end of the day, they have to have a sense of confidence in what you're doing, and you have to have a sense of credibility when dealing with them, right? And a lot of that just comes from day-to-day blocking and tackling, and also spending time with them. The board in particular, I think there's a couple of avenues. One thing to never forget is boards get packets before every meeting and they read them. Do what you can to insert some lessons learned, some learnings, some pre-reading into those materials. Now, is there any guarantee they're going to read them? No. Is there a guarantee that a certain percentage of them will? Yes. Is there, are you pretty sure that they're going to at least skim it? Absolutely. Right? So you're going to be better off from where you were. Now, you want to select those materials to address foundational concepts. You want to select those materials to hit topical things. And to use a military term, you want to prepare the battlefield. Because during every board meeting, they're going to be having a cyber or a cyber risk discussion. Might as well give them some pre-reading that adds value to that. One of the big things I suggest, I tell people all the time, some people like it, some people don't. Spend some time with friendlies in the organization that can coach you on the board. What's important to them, what's not important to them, how they like getting information, what do they resonate with, et cetera, et cetera. Lay out the dynamics. Work with them, this friendly, to help you figure out what some of the right messaging is and what needs to be there. And then also ask them which board members are more open to having these conversations. Every meeting, basic rule of meetings are won and lost before you enter the room. So you want to prepare the battlefield, that before you meet with the board, you've already met with some of the members and you started warming them up, understanding them, understanding the messaging, right? Your coach has helped you, you found your way to some board members, and spend some time with that. Right? Understand what's going on. Those are the basic mechanics, and take the feedback. Another basic mechanics: practice, practice, practice. One of the characteristics as you go up the chain, they're more interested in the bottom line than they are everything else. Everything else is just, just net it out for me. And doing it and telling a story that's understandable is a great way of doing it. Many people in our industry talk about dumbing it down. They don't want you to dumb it down. They want you to get to the so what. Why do I care? Expression to remember is, if a board member asks you what time it is, don't tell them how to build a watch. They want to know what time it is. What time is it? It's 5:16. Thank you. Right? Oh, let me take a look at my, did I show you my new Apple Watch? Oh, I got 3 watches here. There's different times. Hey, do you like this band? It's made from an alligator. They don't care, right? It's 5:17 now. It's 5:17. It's all they care about, right? And so that's very, very important. You have to answer the so what. Now, we talk about they like pretty pictures. Why do they like pretty pictures? Simple. because you can display a lot of intricate, detailed information very quickly in an image, much faster than you can in words. We as humans respond to visual cues a lot faster than we do words, and we capture a lot better. So if you're working with let's say you're working with NIST 800-171, and you're, depending on the version, you either got 14 or 17 domains. If I put that in front of you as a spider diagram, and the outer shell is our desired state, our inner line is where we are, I can pick up the deltas on 17 points very, very quickly, and I could start diving in. What do we need to do here? Right? How much money do you need? What support do you need? What resources do you need? As opposed to going 5 pages of writing to try to distill it. Yeah. I know there's a lot there.
So, the question I'm going to ask you then is, how technical can we get with the board? You gave the metaphor of the watch entering the time versus, meandering on all this extra detail. So how technical are we allowed to get? And corollary to that then is, you mentioned graphics, but metrics are also part of this question.
Oh, huge. When you can provide quantitative data, do it. When you can't, right? And don't try to fluff it. When you can get down to tangible metrics, perfect. If you need to give a range or need to give a magnitude, you're going to have to make some judgment calls. And this is one of the reasons you want to spend time with your friendly beforehand, and you want to spend time with boards and board members beforehand. What do you like to see? How do you prefer to see it? What goes over the best, right? So there's a lot going on there. And you need to tune it. This takes practice. The first time in, actually every time in, don't worry about being perfect. Worry about being not wrong, right? Because you're going to have to learn over time. And remember, the board members cut more than just cyber. Some boards are more technical than others, but I'm willing to bet, like on the audit committee, which are basically financial people, the technology stuff is going to start sounding like a Charlie Brown adult, right? Wah, 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 wah. They're not there. You put numbers in front of them and figures, right? You put an analogy in front of them. Hey, we need $500,000 to finish our, I'm going to make it up, MFA rollout. Well, what if we only give you $250,000? Well, we can't cover the entire enterprise. That would be like building a house with half a roof. It's a nice start, but the first storm that comes in, we've destroyed the inside. Right? Those are the kind of conversations you want to have, recognizing a big part of the board are not technical. Actually, if you look at the percentages of board members, very few have a technical background or a technical understanding. You go to a company like Apple, you're going to get a much higher percentage.
So this is one, the practitioner is unlikely to be able to get an audience with a board director or board member.
Yes.
So that's more directed at the CISO level. I always counsel, don't go into any meeting you don't know the outcome.
Yes.
Meetings are not meant to be a full discussion. I will speak to my own personal experience where I had one of my own board meetings get out of hand because we went off the agenda, and one of the directors, because they're people too, right? It isn't just a dry numbers conversation. People have emotions. There's a psychology. There could be fear.
And they have good days and bad days.
They have good days and bad days. And this was a bad day. And this became a very bad day for the CEO who runs the board, because we went off the map, right? And one of the things I learned from that, and this is where I counsel CISOs, is you should be having these relationships and pulling this out beforehand. When you get to the board meeting, this is where read aheads work for you, but it's the relationships and the meetings that are going to drive that outcome much better for you than trying to roll the dice on what you're going to be able to do in a subordinate position to an overall board. And so that's where meeting in advance for the executives really sets the stage. And in the practitioner level, that's the fluid dynamics you want to be encouraging to help yourself in doing that.
And the expression for that is you want to dig the well before you're thirsty.
Yes, because then it's too late, right? Again, managing relationships. And another one just on that same thing that I think about. So Summer Fowler, another IANS faculty, and she teaches a class on how to build metrics for the board, because everyone's always metrics. And I'm sure a lot of practitioners roll their eyes when they hear metrics, because we think, great, performative numbers that drive us in a wrong way. Metrics are meant to tell a story.
Yes.
Going back to my point, there is no right answer on this metric or that metric or this metric. In Summer's story, she talks about how she's a CISO and how her board has her report risk in a heat map style format. She personally hates the heat map style. It doesn't matter. It's what that board's culture and understanding is, and you have to go to where that is. And so when you're crafting those graphics and crafting those metrics, that's a part of those meet ahead discussions you have with the board, where they're now collaborating and helping you define what you're going to present. And then when you present it, there's no question what it means or why it's there, or could we do it differently? Now we're just, again, debating the point and the story that we're being informed about.
So let's build on that a little. You're talking about going across the organization. One of the best pieces of advice that I think we can give a CISO is to sit down with the chief risk officer and align their practices with the overall risk management practices across the enterprise. Let me give you two simple examples. If they use heat maps, use a heat map. I agree with you. Heat maps have their issues, but if that's what the corporate practice is, okay, right? It's more important to get the right message across. Now, in all fairness, when I've seen a CRO, a chief risk officer, use heat maps, they usually have definitions in the levels. So it's a little more than, gut feel, right? But that's very, very important, because that's what the rest of the organization is seeing. And now you can focus on the deltas and the particular aspects of your dimension of the business, the cyber dimension of the business, instead of having to deal with getting them to understand your way of reporting. And there's a lot of examples around that. Another one is, the CRO will usually have broad categories of risks, tiered risks in buckets. They're usually in 4 or 5. Well, the buckets that you use should map to their buckets, because it's part of a roll-up. And again, if they're already reporting to everybody that you need to report to, you don't want to spend the time talking about why you're different, why your reporting's different. You want to talk about the substance within that. We're back to up, down, across.
So I've covered all of these questions, and now we're into the final piece. Is there what would you like to leave the listeners with?
Okay, so we discussed a variety of topics here. I guess picking up on the last one, there's a couple of things that are kind of swirling around, a couple messages. One is, when asked what time it is, don't tell them how to build a watch. Dig your well before you're thirsty. All right. Meetings are won and lost before you walk in the room. I would also add, bad news doesn't get better. One of the things that it's a natural human tendency is, when things are going sideways or not going well, there's a natural tendency of not communicating that. And then, unfortunately, in our business, when things go really bad, they get really bad really fast, and they could be big time. And then the first question you're going to be being asked is, how did you miss it? And then you're going to have to say, well, I didn't really miss it. I just didn't tell you about it. Right. So this conversation doesn't get any better. Those are the things that are popping up. I would also talk about achieving alignment with the business strategy, the security architecture, and operations. That is incredibly critical. Just and also fold into the GRC practices that already exist by becoming a friendly, easy to work with. You develop some credibility. They recognize your knowledge. You learn from each other. Everybody gets stronger together and we raise all boats. I know there's a lot of, expressions in here, but it does make it more memorable and they all happen to be true.
And I think that's the hardest part about all of this is in a field where we're used to thinking technically of a problem. The problem is people, and it's not people the way we think about it and the users that we are defending. It is this leadership that is made of people, and how relationships and communication is ultimately what dictates the entire spectrum and the panoply of what you can do. But it's going to be those relationships, your culture, and what's needed for your organization that's fundamentally going to drive success or failure, which means bad things happen and there's a lot of headaches in between.
Yes.
And so with that, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Speaking of risk, the next episode is with Pierre David, and we are going to be talking about cyber insurance on the 12th of February. So tune back in for another Unicorn Dispatch Live, as well as check out the SCYTHE YouTube channel for all the recordings. I think we've got like 20 of these that we've been doing over however long I've been doing this. I don't remember. Like I said, it's roughly twice a month. We kind of start on time sometimes. Hey, you get what you pay for. See you around.
Thanks, Bryson. Good to see everyone.